Welcome to Dialogue Doodles. I'm Jack, and today we're exploring a fascinating story that might surprise you. How one of science's greatest revolutionaries started as what many considered a mediocre student. With us today is Professor Edward Thompson, a renowned expert in the history of science. Edward, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jack. I'm delighted to be here to discuss Darwin's remarkable journey.
You know, Edward, when most people think of Charles Darwin, they picture the distinguished scientist with his iconic beard. But I'm curious about young Charles. What was he like growing up?
Well, Jack, Darwin was born into quite a privileged family in 1809. His father was a successful physician, and his grandfather was the famous Erasmus Darwin. But what's fascinating is that young Charles didn't exactly live up to the family's intellectual reputation, at least not initially.
Really? That's quite different from what most people might expect. How did that manifest in his early education?
He struggled considerably with the classical education system of the time. His teachers found him unremarkable, and he was actually criticized for spending too much time on what they considered frivolous pursuits, collecting beetles, conducting chemical experiments with his brother Erasmus in their makeshift laboratory.
So even then his scientific curiosity was showing through, even if it wasn't appreciated in the formal educational system.
Exactly. And this is what makes Darwin's story so compelling. While he was considered a disappointment in traditional academics, he was actually developing the very traits that would later make him extraordinary: keen observation, methodical experimentation, and an insatiable curiosity about the natural world.
That's fascinating. It really challenges our modern notions about early academic success predicting later achievement, doesn't it?
Indeed, Jack. And what's particularly interesting is how Darwin's father, frustrated with his son's academic performance, once told him, "You care for nothing but shooting, dogs, and rat catching, and you'll be a disgrace to yourself and all your family."
Oh my! That must have been quite harsh for young Charles to hear. How did he respond to that kind of pressure?
Well, initially, his father sent him to study medicine at Edinburgh University, following in the family footsteps. But Charles found himself unable to stomach watching surgeries. Remember, this was before anesthesia, and eventually abandoned the medical path.
So here we have a young man who's seemingly failing at everything his family expects of him. It's starting to sound like a familiar story of parental expectations versus personal inclinations.
Exactly. But here's where the story takes an interesting turn. His father then suggested he become a clergyman and sent him to Christ's College, Cambridge. And it was at Cambridge where everything changed, primarily due to one crucial relationship.
This would be Professor Henslow, right? The mentor who changed everything?
Yes, John Stevens Henslow, professor of botany at Cambridge. Darwin later described meeting Henslow as the one circumstance which influenced my career more than any other. Their relationship really exemplifies the transformative power of good mentorship.
Tell us more about this relationship. What made it so special?
They would take long walks together, with Henslow sharing his deep knowledge of botany, geology, and natural philosophy. These weren't just casual strolls. They were moving seminars where Darwin's natural curiosity found its first real academic outlet.
It's amazing how sometimes the right mentor can spot potential that others miss. What was it that Henslow saw in Darwin?
Henslow recognized something that Darwin's previous teachers had missed: his methodical mind and keen powers of observation. He saw past the struggling classical student to the natural scientist within.
You know, this reminds me of how many modern educators talk about different types of intelligence and learning styles. Darwin seems like a perfect example of someone who just needed the right environment to flourish.
Absolutely. And Henslow didn't just teach Darwin. He actively championed him. When the opportunity arose for a naturalist to join the HMS Beagle's voyage, it was Henslow who recommended Darwin, despite the fact that Charles was still an undergraduate.
That recommendation for the Beagle voyage must have been quite a leap of faith on Henslow's part, considering Darwin was still technically an undergraduate.
It absolutely was. And here's what makes it even more remarkable. Henslow wasn't just recommending Darwin for a simple research trip. The Beagle voyage was a prestigious government-sponsored expedition that would last 5 years. It was an extraordinary opportunity.
But Darwin's father initially opposed this opportunity, didn't he? Given what we know about their earlier relationship, I'd love to hear how that played out.
Yes, Dr. Darwin initially refused to let his son go, viewing it as yet another distraction. He said something quite telling. "If you can find any man of common sense who advises you to go, I will give my consent."
Ah, that sounds like quite a challenge. How did young Charles respond?
Well, this is where Darwin's uncle, Josiah Wedgwood, played a crucial role. He intervened on Charles's behalf, convincing Dr. Darwin that the voyage would be valuable for his son's future. It's another example of how mentorship and support can come from unexpected places.
You know, Edward, it strikes me that there's an interesting pattern here. Darwin's transformation seems to have depended on this network of support. Henslow's recognition of his potential, his uncle's advocacy.
That's a crucial observation, Jack. It really highlights how scientific genius doesn't develop in isolation. Even Darwin, who would later be portrayed as a lone revolutionary thinker, relied heavily on this support network during his formative years.
It makes me wonder, how different might the history of science be if Henslow hadn't taken those walks with young Darwin, or if his uncle hadn't intervened?
It's a fascinating counterfactual to consider. Without Henslow's mentorship, Darwin might have remained that struggling student his father worried about. The theory of evolution might have taken decades longer to develop or emerged in a very different form.
This really emphasizes the importance of mentorship in science, doesn't it? Not just in terms of knowledge transfer, but in recognizing and nurturing potential.
Exactly. And what's particularly interesting is how Henslow's mentorship style, those walking conversations, the hands-on learning, aligned perfectly with Darwin's natural way of learning and thinking. It was almost like a key finding its lock.
Speaking of Darwin's natural way of thinking, those early experiments with his brother Erasmus in their makeshift laboratory, did those experiences influence his later scientific approach?
Those early experiments were absolutely crucial, Jack. In fact, they established patterns that would define his later scientific work: careful observation, methodical documentation, and most importantly, the willingness to learn through trial and error.
So in a way, what his teachers saw as distractions were actually laying the groundwork for his future scientific methodology.
Precisely. And this points to something quite profound about education and scientific development. Sometimes what looks like failure or distraction in a conventional academic setting is actually innovation and genius taking shape in its own unique way.
That's fascinating. You know, as we wrap up our discussion about Darwin's early years, I'm struck by how relevant his story is to modern discussions about education and scientific development.
Yes, and it raises important questions about how we identify and nurture scientific talent today. Are we perhaps missing modern Darwins because they don't fit our conventional academic mold?
That's a powerful question. What lessons do you think we can draw from Darwin's early journey?
I think there are 3 key takeaways. First, the crucial role of mentorship. Henslow saw potential where others saw mediocrity. Second, the importance of hands-on experimentation and self-directed learning. And third, the value of giving young scientists the freedom to follow their curiosity.
And it's worth noting that all this happened before Darwin even set foot on the Beagle. His transformation from struggling student to budding scientist was already well underway.
Exactly. The Beagle voyage wasn't the beginning of Darwin's scientific journey. It was the culmination of years of personal development, supported by key mentors and family members who ultimately believed in his potential.
Edward, this has been an absolutely fascinating discussion about Darwin's early years. Before we wrap up, is there one final thought you'd like to share with our listeners?
I think Darwin's early life shows us that great scientific minds don't always fit our preconceptions. Sometimes the most revolutionary thinkers start as ordinary students who simply need the right environment and support to flourish. It's a reminder to look beyond conventional measures of academic success.
What a perfect note to end on. Thank you, Edward, for sharing these insights about young Darwin's journey from struggling student to scientific pioneer. And thank you, listeners, for joining us on this fascinating exploration of how one of science's greatest revolutionaries found his path. Until next time, keep curious.